What's up, people? It's Adrian from Draft Time. Today's Thursday. We got the Week 3 NFL main FanDuel slate coming up on Sunday, $250,000 to first place. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. All right, so let's come over here and filter for quarterbacks. And you got some pretty big name guys playing in this slate. You got Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, and Jalen Hurts all playing in the same slate. The only guy missing is Josh Allen. But out of all those guys, I like Pat Mahomes' matchup the best going up against Atlanta, who's ranked 26th against opposing quarterbacks. And if you look at what Jalen Hurts did to Atlanta last week, he finished with 24.8 going up against that same defense. So you got Mahomes playing with no Isaiah Pacheco. They might rely a lot more on Mahomes this game. He is pretty expensive, though, at $8,700. So I would consider fading him in your GPPs. But I do like him in cash lineups. But if you are going to put Pat Mahomes in your GPP lineups, I would strongly consider stacking him with Travis Kelce because those two are both very highly correlated. And speaking of correlation, I wanted to show you guys this new feature we just added. If you come over here to NFL and click on player correlation, this is a new tool that we just added. And let me come over here to the main slate. And this list is basically showing you all of the most correlated players, both positively correlated and also negatively correlated for this particular slate. And, right away you see Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb. They're the highest correlated duo of this slate. Tyreek Hill and Tua, they're highly correlated, although Tua is not playing. But maybe if you really want to go sleeper, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, maybe you go with Skylar Thompson and Tyreek Hill. So if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see right over here, Kelce and Mahomes. We give them a correlation score of 4.21. So they're very highly correlated. Whenever Mahomes has a good game, Kelce usually has a good game and vice versa. So like I said, if you are going to consider putting Mahomes in a GPP, I would strongly consider putting him with Kelce. And really, it wouldn't take much for them to break the slate because you're not getting very much production out of tight ends this season. So even if Kelce gives you, 15 fantasy points, that's very high for what tight ends have been giving you this season. Then you got Lamar Jackson going up against Dallas, which is a really good defense. Not a great matchup. $8,800 is pretty expensive. He's actually the most expensive quarterback of the slate. Now, that being said, you did have Derek Carr go off against Dallas last week, but I don't expect Dallas to have another repeat poor performance. You got Micah Parsons. He's going to be all over Lamar Jackson. And Lamar Jackson is not really a guy that you stack much because he usually just has big games on his own, although he is slightly correlated with his tight ends. If you come over here to correlation report, let's type up Lamar Jackson. And you see you got Mark Andrews and Lamar Jackson. Correlation score of 0.78, so not very high on the correlation scale, although still positively correlated, both with bad matchups. So yeah, I'm not crazy about Lamar Jackson this week. But let's come back. You got Jalen Hurts coming off a pretty big week, but he's going up against New Orleans, and their defense is pretty stout. Now, it's hard just to say that, just outright fade Jalen Hurts, and same goes to Lamar Jackson. It's kind of hard just to outright fade those guys just because they're such good fantasy quarterbacks. But I'm not going to go crazy with either of these guys that week. Then you got CJ Stroud going up against Minnesota. That's not a good matchup either. You see what Minnesota's defense did to San Francisco last week. And, it's hard for me to say this as a Dolphins fan, but Brian Flores is a great defensive coordinator. But if you are going to go with CJ Stroud in a GPP, I would consider stacking him with Nico. Those guys have a very high correlation score. Then you got Kyler Murray going up against Detroit. Him and Marvin Harrison went off last game, but pretty much all of it was in the first quarter. So I'm not going to get caught up in that hype. I mean, he does have a very, very good matchup going up against Detroit, but he's $8,300, so he's pretty expensive. And he doesn't have a very high correlation score with his receivers because he gets you a lot of rushing touchdowns. So he's not really a guy that you stack with another receiver. Although, a lot of people are going to be high on him and Marvin Harrison. And maybe you throw them into a few lineups together. But, I'm not crazy about Marvin Harrison. Even though he had a big game last game, he just doesn't look good, man. But some quarterbacks that I really like, I like Jared Goff going up against Arizona, who are ranked 29th against opposing quarterbacks. Pretty good matchup there, only $7,500. Another guy I like, Brock Purdy going up against the Rams, ranked 28th against opposing quarterbacks. Really like that matchup, only $7,400. I like stacking him with Kittle. They have a pretty high correlation score. You also might want to stack him with Ayuk with no Debo Samuel. Maybe even go him and Juwan Jennings kind of as a sleeper play. I also like Baker Mayfield at $7,700, having a pretty big season so far. Finished with 29.6 in week 1 and then 19.8 in week 2. Pretty good matchup there going up against Denver, who are ranked 23rd against opposing quarterbacks. I would also strongly consider stacking him with Chris Godwin, who's still only $6,600 despite having pretty big games in his first 2 weeks. So I love Baker Mayfield, although I don't think that's going to be a sleeper play this week. I think a lot of people are going to be all over that stack. I also like Derek Carr going up against Philly, who's ranked 31st against opposing quarterbacks. Now, they did raise his price. He's $7,900. So not a great value play. So he's not a guy I would throw into any cash lineups, especially since he's going to be pretty low owned. But I do like maybe throwing him into a couple GPP lineups, maybe him and Shaheed or him and Chris Olave because of their matchups and their upside. Now, if you really, really want to go sleeper pick, maybe you throw in some Skylar Thompson and stack him with either Achane or Tyreek Hill because he's only $6,600. And you see that there's huge upside to going pretty cheap on quarterbacks. Some of the top lineups last week had Daniel Jones and Malik Neighbors in it. So, and also, when you look at the correlation score, you see Tyreek Hill and Tua actually have the second highest correlation score. And then Achane and Tua have a pretty high correlation score as well. So I think there's some huge upside to that. Definitely some pretty high downside risk. But yeah, those are the quarterbacks that I like. So let's go ahead and take a look at running backs now. Now, before I get into the running backs, I want to make sure you guys subscribe to our YouTube channel if you're not already subscribed. Also, make sure you smash that like button for this video and head over to X and follow us on X. And if you're not already subscribed to Draft Time, make sure you go to drafttime.com and you can sign up for a 7-day trial. All right, let's get back into the video. So taking a look at running backs, you got Jordan Mason, who worked his way all the way up to the top of the running backs leaderboard. He's the highest projected running back for the slate. Thing is, they raised his price to $8,300, and he has a pretty bad matchup. So he's a guy I would consider fading. But with that being said, even though $8,300 seems like a pretty high price, Christian McCaffrey used to be priced in the 10,000s. So it's still a pretty decent price for Jordan Mason, and he does end up in the optimized lineup, the number one lineup, right over here in the flex spot. So, like I said, he's a guy I would consider fading. And if you are going to do like a Purdy Kittle stack, I would fade Jordan Mason because if you come over here in the correlation and let's filter for San Francisco, negative. George Kittle and McCaffrey are very negatively correlated. So if you are going to stack Kittle with Purdy, make sure you fade Jordan Mason, who's expensive anyways, so he's worth fading. Then you got Bijan Robinson, who has a pretty bad matchup going up against Kansas City. Ranked number 6 against opposing running backs. He's $8,500, so he's the second most expensive running back on the slate. Saquon Barkley is the most expensive guy, but it's not a good matchup for him, and he still hasn't had that huge game yet. He's more of a consistent player. Consistently gets you 10 plus fantasy points with his with his rushing and receiving out the backfield. But we're still waiting on him having that huge game, and he's just not worth it to me because I just don't think he has that much upside. Devon Achane going up against the Seahawks defense, $7,700 is a really good price for him considering he had pretty big games week 1 and week 2. Now, with that being said, a lot of his production so far has come from the passing game with 7 catches in both his first 2 games. So is he going to be able to still have a good game, catching the ball with Skylar Thompson as his quarterback? I'm not sure. You also got Raheem Mostert coming back. So maybe Achane is a guy that you consider fading, although it's very hard to fade a guy like him with the kind of productivity that he's having, who's only $7,700. You also got Alvin Kamara coming off a huge week, finished with 4 touchdowns. I mean, obviously, I don't expect him to have a repeat performance, especially going up against Philadelphia. They rank 11th against opposing running backs, and they raised his price to $8,400, so he's not a great value play. So he's not a guy that I'm going to have a lot of, although I will throw him into a few just in case, he continues having this big season that he's having so far. Then you got Jonathan Taylor, and he's kind of a guy like Bijan Robinson, not very high upside, but pretty consistent. But $8,000 is pretty expensive, and I don't see enough upside in him. Then you got Saquon Barkley, who's the highest priced running back of the slate. I'm not crazy about his matchup going up against New Orleans, ranked 4th against opposing running backs. Then you got Jamar Gibbs and David Montgomery both going up against Arizona, who's dead last against opposing running backs. So they both got pretty good matchups. $7,900 for Jamar Gibbs. David Montgomery is $7,100. So maybe you do one of each in a few lineups just because of their upside with that matchup against Arizona. Then you got Josh Jacobs, who's actually questionable, going up against Tennessee. Tennessee is actually pretty good against the run, but at $7,300, that's a very good value for Josh Jacobs, who's become a workhorse for Green Bay. Had 16 carries in week 1 for 84, and then 32 carries week 2 for 151 yards. Now, if Josh Jacobs does end up missing a game, take a look at Emmanuel Wilson, who I think is priced in the 5,000s. With Green Bay, they had over 200 yards rushing the ball last week, so they're looking like a very good running team. Then you got Rashad White going up against Denver, ranked 31st against opposing running backs. That's a pretty good matchup there. $7,000 is a pretty good price for him, but he's questionable. So if he does end up missing the game, everyone's going to be all over Bucky Irving. Then you got Aaron Jones, who's a very good value play at $6,600, but he is questionable. So if he does end up missing the game, take a look at Ty Chandler. Then you got the Seahawks running backs, Zach Charbonnet and Kenneth Walker. Obviously, if Kenneth Walker misses the game, everyone's going to be all over Zach Charbonnet, who's $6,700, very cheap for him. If Kenneth Walker does end up playing, $7,500 is a decent price because he had a pretty big week one, finished with 20.9 fantasy points. So maybe he's a guy you consider throwing into your lineups. Another guy I might throw in, Najee Harris, going up against the Chargers, who are ranked 22nd against opposing running backs. Pretty decent matchup there. $6,400 is very cheap for a guy he got 20 carries in week one and 17 carries in week two. So the guy is getting a lot of carries and he's only $6,400. So maybe consider throwing him into a few lineups. Then you got the Kansas City running backs, Samaje Perine and Carson Steele. You got Perine, who's 6,200, and Carson Steele, who's 5,200. So I think of the two guys, Carson Steele definitely has the higher upside. So I'm gonna throw a bunch of Carson Steele into my lineups. Maybe I'll throw a couple Perines in, but the guy who I think has high upside is Carson Steele, and he might end up getting more touches than Perine. They really like him in Kansas City. Now my sleeper running back, that's going to be this guy right here. Okay, Chuba Hubbard going up against the Raiders, who are ranked 25th against opposing running backs. Only $5,800, so a very good price for Chuba Hubbard, who a lot of people were high on in the beginning of the season on their fantasy teams. He was being drafted, relatively high, and he had a bad week one, but he had a decent week two. Finished with 10 carries for 64 yards and then 5 targets, 4 receptions. And now they actually made the move to Andy Dalton in Carolina. So who knows? Maybe that offense will get a little bit of a spark this week. Now, if you have Chuba Hubbard in your fantasy team, in your season long, I got a great name for your team, okay? Chuba me. I can't say the rest, but fill in the blanks. But yeah, those are all the running backs. So let's go ahead and take a look at receivers now. So you got CeeDee Lamb and Amon-Ra St. Brown, both pretty expensive. Not a lot of upside because of their price. But if you are going to throw them into some of your GPPs, I would make sure you stack them with their respective quarterbacks because they both have pretty high correlation scores. Dak Prescott and CD actually have the highest correlation score out of any duo in the NFL. You got Devontae Smith with no A.J. Brown playing for the Eagles. So it's a pretty decent play there, although they raised his price to $8,000. So it's a decent play, Devontae Smith, but I think there's a lot better value plays at wide receiver. Justin Jefferson, $9,200, and he's also questionable. Not crazy about his matchup against Houston. Kind of expensive. Jefferson really hasn't done much besides that one big touchdown last week. So I'm not crazy about Justin Jefferson with Sam Darnold throwing him the ball. You got Nico Collins, who's questionable, going up against Minnesota, who are ranked 29th against opposing receivers. Now, with that being said, I think that Minnesota defense is actually better against receivers than what that stat indicates. But still, $7,600 is a great price for Nico Collins if he does end up playing. Had 135 yards last week and 117 yards week one. And maybe you consider stacking him with some CJ Stroud because they have a pretty high correlation score together. Now, a lot of people, myself included, are pretty high on Brandon Ayuk at $6,500. That's really cheap for Brandon Ayuk. Going up against the Rams, who are ranked 24th against opposing receivers. So that's a great matchup, great price, $6,500. No Deebo Samuel. So a lot of people are going to be all over Ayuk. We have him projected to be 28.5% owned. So going to have pretty high ownership. So if you are going to fade Ayuk, I would consider fading him for either Kittle or fading him for Juwan Jennings. Because if Ayuk doesn't have a good game, Juwan Jennings or Kittle have a high chance of having a good game. And Ayuk missed all of training camp, so he's not 100% up to speed with the rest of the team. Tyreek Hill, $9,000. Not a lot of people are going to be owning him with Skylar Thompson as his quarterback. So I'm not crazy about Tyreek, but if you do pick up Tyreek Hill, make sure you stack him with Skylar Thompson because Skylar Thompson is only 6,600. So if Tyreek Hill has a couple of big touchdowns, then you're talking about Skylar Thompson at 6,600 having 2 touchdowns that could break the slate. Then you got Marvin Harrison Jr. at $7,500. I know a lot of people are going to be high on him because of his game last week. But like I mentioned earlier, he scored all his points in one quarter, and he just doesn't look that good to me. So even though he has a good matchup against Detroit, I'm not going to be going crazy with Marvin Harrison. I like Chris Olave at $6,700. That's a very good price for him, who had a very good year last year. And he's going against Philadelphia, who's dead last against opposing receivers. So maybe you throw in some Derek Carr, Chris Olave stacks. Maybe you throw in some Shaheed, Derek Carr stacks. because of their upside from that matchup. Another guy is Chris Godwin at $6,600, a great price for him. I've been high on him the first 2 weeks. He's going to be pretty high owned though because now everyone's starting to catch on. And you look at his first 2 weeks, had 117 yards and 83 yards in the touchdown week 1. So he's having a great season. I would consider stacking him with some Baker Mayfield. Not crazy about Mike Evans though with his price at $8,300. You got Stephon Diggs going up against his former team. Maybe there's that revenge game factor, only $6,900. And if Nico Collins ends up missing a game, then this is not going to be much of a sleeper pick. Everyone's going to be all over Diggs. And the same goes to Tank Dell. But maybe you throw Diggs into your lineup even if Nico does play because of that revenge game factor. Maybe you stack him with some Stroud. Then you got Amari Cooper, who I think he gets picked up by the optimizer. Yeah, you see, he does get picked up by the optimizer. He has a great matchup going up against the Giants, and he's only $6,000. Now, I know he hasn't been doing well, and that the Browns haven't been doing very well. But if you look at his targets, he had 8 targets last week and 9 targets week 1. So he's getting the targets, and he's going up against a pretty bad Giants defense. So he's a guy I really like. Another guy you might want to consider is Jameson Williams. Maybe you stack him with Goff instead of stacking Amon-Ra with Goff because Jameson Williams has been getting a ton of targets. 9 targets week 1, 11 targets last week. So at $6,300, there's a lot of upside there. I already talked about Shaheed. Jalen Waddle, he's only $6,600. So between him and Skylar Thompson, they're both $6,600. You could have a stack for $13,200 total. So there is some upside there. And all they need is one big play with that explosive offense. But yeah, let's go ahead and take a look at tight ends now. So the top tight end of the slate is Trey McBride going up against Detroit. He's $6,800, so he's cheaper than Kittle and Laporta and Kelsey. And he had 6 targets last week and then 9 targets week 1. So he's getting a lot of targets for a tight end. And like I mentioned earlier, there's not a lot of production coming from the tight end spot. So he's a guy I'm high on. George Kittle is another guy I'm high on, going up against the Rams, who are ranked 30th against opposing tight ends. And he's $7,100, and he had a big week last week. So I really like Kittle. And like I mentioned earlier, I like stacking him with Purdy. Then you got Laporta, who hasn't done much this season, and so many people were high on him. But he's going up against Arizona, who, believe it or not, even though they have a bad defense, they're pretty good against opposing tight ends. So I'm not crazy about Laporta, but you never know at the tight end position. I mean, any of these guys could go off, and it could end up being Laporta this week. Could end up also being Travis Kelce, going up against Atlanta, ranked 27th against opposing tight ends. $7,200. He's the most expensive tight end of the slate. But maybe you consider stacking him with some Mahomes. But maybe you're not high on any of these tight ends and you want to save some money. Well, $5,400 for Jake Ferguson is a very good price if he plays. He's a guy who averaged 10 fantasy points per game last season. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have for tight ends. Let's go ahead and take a look at defenses now. So at the top of the defenses, you got the Browns going against the Giants. Then you got the Raiders going against Carolina, the Bucks going against the Broncos, the Niners going against the Rams, Seahawks going against Skylar Thompson. So pretty good matches for these guys, but they're all pretty expensive. If you want to save some money, maybe you go with the Titans going up against Malik Willis, $3,700. That's a pretty good price. Chargers going up against the Steelers for $3,900. Or maybe to save some money, you take the Colts going up against Caleb Williams and the Bears. That's a pretty good matchup there. But yeah, that's pretty much what I have for all of the positions. Now I wanted to go ahead and show you some of the lineups and some of the strategies I was working on. But before I do that, let's go ahead and run the top lineup just to see what it spits out. You got Jalen Hurts, Aaron Jones, Achane, Chris Godwin, Amari Cooper, Brandon Ayuk, Trey McBride, Jordan Mason, and the Panthers defense going against Gardner Minshew and the Raiders. So that's another defense that maybe you want to save money on at $3,000. You might want to look at them. But that's not giving us a stack. So let me see what the top stack is. So let's come over here to rules. Always include a quarterback and one receiver from the same team. Okay, so the top stack is Mahomes and Rashee Rice. But yeah, let me go ahead and show you some of the strategies I've been working on. So firstly, I just got the default top 5 lineups. That's basically 5 lineups with the optimizer with no settings on it. Then I got 2 lineups with Mahomes and Kelsey. So doing a Mahomes-Kelsey stack. I got 1 lineup with Goff and St. Brown. And I made sure I'm excluded Jameson Williams in this lineup. But then I got 1 with Goff and Jameson Williams. And I made sure I'm excluded Amon-Ra. Then I got 1 lineup with Purdy and Ayuk. And I made sure I'm excluding George Kittle. But then I got a lineup with Purdy and Kittle. And for this one, I made sure I'm excluded Ayuk and I'm excluding Jordan Mason. And I'm excluding Jordan Mason because if you look at the correlation between Kittle and Christian McCaffrey, they're actually one of the most negatively correlated duo in the whole NFL. Then I got a Baker Mayfield, Chris Godwin stack. I got an Alvin Kamara, Derek Carr stack. And that's a stack I didn't talk about earlier I talked about doing Carr and Olave and Carr and Shaheed, but you can also do Carr and Kamara because Kamara gets a lot of passing or receiving touchdowns. Then I got two lineups with Achane and Skylar Thompson, which I think has a lot of upside because if you look at Tua and Devon Achane, they're actually the highest correlated quarterback running back duo in the whole NFL. And with Skylar Thompson only being $6,600, there's a lot of upside to that lineup. Then I got Derek Carr and Shaheed. Then I got what I like to call my big GPP stack. And what I did with this one is I put 100% weight on the GPP projections. And then I applied these rules. I got a quarterback and two receivers from the same team. Then I said also include a receiver from the opposing team. And then I said exclude opposing defense against your quarterback. And then lastly, I got my cash lineup, which is basically just 100% weight on the cash projections. So I already went and ran all these lineups. So if you come up here and come to save lineups and then come over here to CSV edit, I already imported my FanDuel file. So you see all of the FanDuel entries that I entered. So this one right here, $500,000 NFL Rush. That's just the $3 tournament with guaranteed overlay with $50,000 going to first place. Then I got the $15 Sunday Million with $250,000 going to first place. Then I just entered a bunch of 50-50s. So for the 50-50s, three of them, I'm just using the default top lineup. So that's just lineup number one over here. I set that as the default lineup. And for the rest of the 50-50s, I used my cash lineup. Okay, let's come up here to the Sunday NFL Rush. And for that one, I have 5 lineups with just the default top 5. I have my Mahomes Kelsey stack. Then I have my Goff St. Brown stack, Goff Jameson stack, Purdy and Ayuk, Carr and Kamara, Carr and Olave, Carr Shaheed, Skylar and Achane. And that's actually the second Skylar Achane lineup. The first Skylar Achane lineup I put into the Sunday NFL Million. For that one, I got lineups 1 and 2. I didn't go with the top 5, just went with the top 2. I went with Kittle and Purdy, Baker and Godwin, Skylar and Achane, and then the big GPP stack that I was talking about earlier. Let's take a look at what that spit out. Okay, so it gave you Kyler, Marvin Harrison, and then Trey McBride from Arizona going against the Lions. And then from the Lions, it gave you Jameson Williams. It also picked up a bunch of low-owned guys because I'm using the GPP ownership adjusted projections. So it's got Kyler Murray at 8%, Marvin Harrison at 9%, and then the Panthers defense at 4%. So that's what happens when you use the ownership adjusted projections. It picks up a lot more low-owned players. So yeah, let's go ahead and come back over here and take a look at exposure. And you see you got 100% exposure to Achane. So definitely going to fade him in a bunch of lineups. A lot of Amari Cooper and Brandon Ayuk and Jordan Mason. So in all of these remaining entries that I haven't assigned lineups to yet, I'm going to fade a lot of those guys. So that's all I have for today. Make sure you go to draftdime.com and sign up for a 7-day trial. That way you have access to all these tools that I'm using in this video, including the new correlation reports. Also, make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube or follow us on Twitter. And if you shoot this video a like and even comment on it, I'd really appreciate that. And good luck to everyone this week.